About 50 years ago, perhaps a little longer than that, one man broke a very significant barrier. A barrier that men had been trying to break for numbers of years. It was thought to be a barrier which was almost mythical. It was impossible to break through. And that was man's struggle in sport to break the 4-minute mile, running a mile in under 4 minutes. Just before it had been broken, people started to think perhaps it can't be done. Perhaps this is the limit of human achievement, that no man can run faster than 4 minutes. And then, now, just recently deceased, Sir Roger Bannister ran a mile in 3 minutes, 59.7 seconds. He'd done it. Now, hundreds and thousands of athletes have been trying to achieve this feat and all came up short. Roger Bannister was the first. And yet, after he had broken that record, hundreds of men beat his time in the subsequent year. 1 year afterwards, he had been beaten 15 times. 15 men had gone faster than Roger Bannister, breaking a record that people thought was impossible. So what was the barrier really? It was up here. Men were capable of it. It was possible. Now God called out to Abraham probably about 4,000 years ago. It's when men and women kind of stepped into history as we know it. As we know, the Bible is one of the oldest historical documents, and it's definitely probably the oldest historical document of man's personal relationship with God. That moment when God said, Abraham, Abraham, and thus began a story, a relationship, where men and women began to hope beyond the simple everyday, beyond the toil of going to work, of tilling the land, of doing whatever it is we do every day, when men like Abraham began to look to the stars and wonder if there was more to life. The problem with life, as we all know, is that it's filled with barriers. The problem with life is that it ends in death, a seemingly and quite evidently insurmountable barrier. And if that's the barrier of life, and we go through so much in life, it's tempting to ask ourselves, what's the point? What's the point of striving for more? What's the point of hoping for more? This was the struggle of the people of Israel. They kind of lived on this promise. There's got to be something more. We feel like we're made for it, and yet life is suffering and life ends in death. That's the plain fact for all of us. And yet through this relationship with God, this people began to hope for more. God calls them out of slavery in Egypt. He says, follow me, and I will show you a land filled with milk and honey. Now that's better than slavery, isn't it? It's a better life than they had, so they followed. They took a risk. They went beyond. They crossed the Red Sea. They entered the land of milk and honey, and guess what? It wasn't what it was cracked up to be. It had limit. They established a land, they were conquered, they were back to square one. Death was still preceded by suffering, and all the joys and sorrows and things that go in between. But the people never lost their hope. We never really lose our hope. It's still there, buried deep down. And then, our first reading today, we have people like the prophets. The prophet Isaiah, who begins to imagine what it would be like to go to the very limit of human existence. in the face of suffering, in the face of our weakness, of our insufficiency, of all the pains and sorrows that we walk into every phase of life, began to imagine what it would be like, what the person would be like, who in the face of all the sufferings of life, with the supreme barrier of death, kept walking into it, kept loving into it, who didn't respond with violence to violence, who kept loving to the very end. And he called this man the suffering servant. He prophesied that this man would come forth from the people of Israel, that this man will be the fruit of all as men's and women's failed attempts over the thousands of years, that God would send such a person to help us to hope beyond death, to help us to walk to the very end of life, right up to death, loving, holding nothing back from life, giving it everything, in the face of anger and hatred and all those things that we faced, to give us the perseverance to love to the very end, to live the fulfilled life. And this man was called the suffering servant. This man was and is Jesus. And on this day, we commemorate the man who is God, who took all of our angst, all of our suffering, all of our conflict, all of our anger, all of our hatred, everything we suffered. He took it upon himself, all of it. And he walked right up to the barrier of death. And on the cross, he passed through it. We hear it in the letter to the Hebrews today. Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Jesus, who we commemorate in this service today, passed through the barrier of death, having loved perfectly throughout, having borne all the slings and arrows of life, and there were many, and we go through them all ourselves, having borne all the mistakes that we made, picked up his cross, was crucified on it, and passed through the barrier of death. If Roger Bannister broke the barrier for the 4-minute mile, Jesus breaks the barrier of death. And since he died and rose from the dead, many thousands, millions, a countless multitude of saints we are called to be, have gone through that barrier, have loved to the very end. Jesus and those who followed him, his saints, the people of God, right here, show that it is possible, even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of sin, to live the fulfilled life. That it requires of us not a part of ourselves, but everything. Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, at the very end of this Lent, a Lent where we have gone inside, where we have gone into the wilderness and explored our own lives, invites us to take one final step. A final step that isn't just about today, but about our everyday. A final step which is a decision that we make many times each and every single day. That in the face of opposition and hopelessness, of hatred, of anger, of our mistakes, we step over the line. We have the courage to go beyond the power of death and into the eternal life, the eternal banquet that is waiting for us. Amen.